from Abuja.
Hello, thank you for being a part of our show. We appreciate you. I'm Magnus Kpakol, and this is Magnus Kpakol GVA. As always, it's all about how we can raise the level of living. That's what it's all about. In view today, the ominous future of crude oil. How will it impact Nigeria? We look at global activities affecting crude oil production and prices from both the supply and demand sides. How should Nigeria prepare for the apparent inauspicious situation facing the crude oil industry? But before that, in our hidden economics, how to govern with crude oil. Now, up next in our quick view, we rank countries by crude oil production per capita. That's coming right up. In 2016, total world oil production averaged well over 80 million barrels per day, with about 44% coming from OPEC members. Should Nigeria continue in OPEC and be limited by how much crude oil it can produce, assuming it improves its capacity to produce much more? And why shouldn't it, given its pressing need for more foreign currency and the uncertain future facing crude oil? In this connection, in liters per year, which of the following major crude oil producers has the highest production per capita in the world? Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Which of the following African countries has the highest crude oil production per capita in liters per year? Algeria, Angola, Libya, and Nigeria. Stay with us for our answers coming up shortly. Last time, we mistakenly included Chad among West African countries. Please note that Chad is not in West Africa. It is among the nations of Central Africa. We regret any issues this might have caused. Now, still in view, the ominous future of crude oil. But up next in our hidden economics, how to govern well with crude oil.
Back in the days, a good man called Mr. Faraday. He gave us the meter, making our lives today better. Shaping a person we build it. We give us computer where they make us educate too. Now all those good people, now them open the way where they make us elevate too. As I they sing my song, Baba you they give me joy. Make you they bless my voice, make you no turn to noise. I feel good.
Do Good by Joel. He wants us to do good like Faraday and Bill Gates. So borrowing from Joel, we need people, good people, that can run our governments if we are to defeat poverty, become economically competitive, and transform our economies to be amongst the best in the world. This is particularly the case if your nation is an oil-producing country. According to Tina Rosenberg, a Pulitzer Prize winner, every nation is worse off in corruption soon after finding crude oil. As she says, finding a hole in the ground that spouts money can be one of the worst things that can happen to a country. In addition, Professor Terry Carl of Stanford University has concluded that many countries that strike crude oil eventually get found among the most economically troubled, the most authoritarian, and the most conflict-ridden in the world, in a phenomenon that is often called the resource curse. What possibly causes this problem? Well, as it turns out, the crude oil industry is probably the world's most capital intensive, so it creates few jobs. In addition, oil production and related revenues tend to concentrate a nation's economy around the government. So instead of putting resources into producing other goods and services and marketing them, many well-placed citizens and connivers spend their time currying favor or simply bribing powerful politicians and government officials who control oil money. Note this: economists Paul Collier and Anke Hoffler found in a series of groundbreaking studies that if a third or more of a country's GDP came from the export of primary commodities, the likelihood of conflict was 22%. And as they also found, similar countries that did not export commodities had a 1% chance. So people governing in oil-producing states, realizing that without much revenue from taxes, which create accountability, they will have to reject the sorcery of economic exploitation and just do good. It's called good governance. Our hidden economics for you.
Everybody pick up your chest. If you know you are the best, never settle for less. Cause I say, don't let nobody deceive you. You know what you want, so do it how you want. Everybody pick up your chest. If you know you are the best, never settle for less. Cause I say, don't let nobody deceive you. You know what you want, so do it how you want.
Before we start our discussion, here are our quick view answers. Kuwait, with a per capita production of 22,860 liters per year, is the top oil producer with the highest crude oil production per capita. Libya is the African country with the highest per capita crude oil production. Nigeria's relatively paltry per capita output of about 800 liters per year requires a serious conversation if the nation's dependence on the oil market is not about to end. For comments, adverts, and sponsorship, please see our information displayed on the screen. Crude oil has probably been the most transformational resource the world has ever seen. But it has started to face challenges from both the demand and supply sides. In our presentation, we will show remarks and documentaries that tell the story poignantly. Please join us. Now here is this presentation. Rob Hopkins, an independent activist and writer on environmental issues, traces the history of the crude oil industry. As he puts it, crude oil has been extremely important, especially as it has helped us to produce many of the goods and services that people depend upon. As he states it, we are historically living in a period he calls the petroleum interval. So now, what happens when the oil runs out?
Yeah, when we take a step back and look over the span of history at what we might call the petroleum interval, it's a short period in history where we've discovered this extraordinary material and then based a whole way of life around it. But as we straddle the top of this energy mountain at this stage. We move from a time where our economic success, our sense of individual prowess and well-being is directly linked to how much of this we consume, to a time when actually our degree of oil dependency is our degree of vulnerability. And it's increasingly clear that we aren't going to be able to rely on the fact that we're going to have this at our disposal forever. For every 4 barrels of oil that we consume, we only discover 1, and that gap continues to widen. There's also the fact that the amount of energy that we get back from the oil that we discover is falling. In the 1930s, we got 100 units of energy back for every 1 that we put in to extract it. Completely unprecedented historically. Already that's fallen to about 11, and that's why now the new breakthroughs, the new frontiers in terms of oil extraction are scrabbling about in Alberta or at the bottom of the oceans. There are 98 oil-producing nations in the world, but of those, 65 have already passed their peak. The moment when the world, on average, passes this peak, people wonder when that's going to happen. And there's an emerging case that maybe that was what happened last July when the oil prices were so high. But are we to assume that the same brilliance and creativity and adaptability that got us up to the top of that energy mountain in the first place is somehow mysteriously going to evaporate when we have to design a creative way back down the other side? No. But the thinking that we have to come up with has to be based on a realistic assessment of where we are. So the question I like to leave you with really is, for all aspects of the things that your community needs in order to thrive, how can it be done in such a way that drastically reduces its carbon emissions while also building resilience? Personally, I feel enormously grateful to have lived through the age of cheap oil. I've been astonishingly lucky. We've been astonishingly lucky. But let us honor what it has brought us and move forward from this point. Because if we cling to it and continue to assume that it can underpin our choices, the future that it presents to us is one which is really unmanageable. And by loving and leaving all that oil has done for us and that the oil age has done for us, we are able to then begin the creation of a world which is more resilient, more nourishing, and in which we find ourselves fitter, more skilled, and more connected to each other. Thank you very much.
Rob Hopkins. Incredible. Now we present this brief documentary from Badfish Castle on YouTube that is riveting in how it shows what can follow the end of oil. While this view is rather too apocalyptic, it nevertheless serves as a good alarm clock to fragile, poor oil industry dependent countries. Let's take a look.
Oil, the lifeblood of modern civilization. But our gas-fueled journey is approaching the end of the line.
We are in an SUV headed down a bumpy road toward a cliff.
More and more, we're gobbling up oil faster than we can pump it out. And what happens when the wells run dry?
The world descends into a giant global recession, and people start pushing other people trying to get at the last of the oil.
That will very quickly ignite the last war we'll ever fight.
The struggle for oil could mean the end of civilization.
The 4 horsemen: war, famine, pestilence, and death.
Oil apocalypse on mega disasters. Our world is a giant machine with billions of moving parts. Its primary fuel is oil. Here in the United States, 98% of our 300 million cars and trucks run on gasoline. Nearly 100% of our farm vehicles are diesel-powered. 99% of our railways run on diesel as well. And all of our planes fly on jet fuel. As long as the oil flows, we'll be just fine. But what happens when it stops? Experts tell us that it's not a question of if, but when.
We always knew that the oil would run out sooner or later. It's a non-renewable resource. but it was always assumed that it would be several generations from now. We would be in our grandchildren's lifetime or sometime after that. And by that time, we'd figure out something else. But here it is, the beginning of the 21st century, and we're already starting to see the signs of global oil production peak. And where's our plan B?
Failing to plan is planning to fail. And I have not seen any plan so far.
A report issued in February 2007 by the U.S. Government Accountability Office states that world oil production is expected to peak sometime within the next few decades. As the world's oil supplies become depleted, we could be faced with rationing, social unrest, and even war.
The demand for oil keeps increasing, particularly with China and India becoming nations of drivers. And with the demand increasing and the supply decreasing, there will be a crunch.
The worst case scenario is a global recession, and the recession seems to be going on and on. The argument of do something about it is increasingly brought to governments, and they turn to military action.
We are on our way to a disaster. So in order for us to avoid that, we better get ready and be prepared.
But while everyone feels the pain at the pump, very little has been done to prepare for the worst.
The average citizen doesn't feel any real threat from this because they've always had what they needed. Technology has always come through, and their leaders have always come through in one way or another, and they just believe that the future is going to be like the past.
But this time, it may be different.
The story of the shift to renewable energy is compelling. In this TED presentation, Quayle Huddock talks about the future of renewable energy. Let's listen to him.
Wind became cost competitive with fossil fuels, and what had once seemed impossible was now happening. Renewable energy started exploding across the country. And it wasn't just our market and our role in it that grew. Everything about renewables got bigger. Wind turbines started as small experimental projects to becoming some of the largest and most sophisticated machines on the planet. They now have a wingspan wider than a 747. They're taller than the Statue of Liberty. And although the blades are as long as 2 semi-trucks, they're light enough to be picked up by 2 people. Wind farms went from small couple turbine projects to now sometimes spanning thousands of acres. And the same thing happened with solar. Just in the last couple of years, we now have solar projects that reach to the horizon. It's not that we don't have challenges, there's plenty of them. Transmission is a huge issue, there's new competition from gas fracking, ever-changing policy. But there's no denying that renewables have passed the tipping point and they're here to stay. Let me tell you why. 10 years ago, only 1% of our new power getting built in this country was from wind. Last year, it was 50%. Here in Hawaii, you're one of 30 states that actually have requirements for a minimum amount of renewables. In Maui, in 2011, you built as much solar as you had in the prior 10 years combined. And today, you have the highest per capita wind and solar of anywhere in the country. I'm sure you've all seen this picture, the world at night. When I look at this now, I don't see all the areas of light, but instead the areas without it. Pretending that these poorest among us don't want or somehow don't deserve electricity, when electricity is so tied to personal and national prosperity, is like denying them a basic human right. And if they follow our path of fossil fuels, we've only magnified the problems of environmental destruction and pollution and energy shortages. By mobilizing millions of communities around the globe to leapfrog directly to renewables, we can at least point the way towards the end of poverty. Because there is no path to global prosperity that doesn't at its core involve access to clean, abundant, and affordable electricity for absolutely everyone. While it's been an honor to be at the forefront of renewables getting bigger for the last decade, I now know it is an even greater honor to focus on helping renewables get smaller over the next decade. If everyone in the world, developed and developing nations, can choose renewables over fossil fuel, if we make that choice at home and support entrepreneurs like Juan around the world, if we unite together as a global community, then we can create the prosperous, clean, and equitable future that we all desire and deserve. Thank you.
We are glad that Nigeria appears to be keen in its understanding of this, as the acting president, Professor Yemi Osinbajo, appears ready and committed to ensure that Nigeria produces visible and significant results quickly. With the intensity of a boxing trainer watching his champion in the ring, policymakers, analysts, and economists are watching every little movement in the oil markets as they scrutinize rig counts and pore over any available market report to try to peer into the future of oil. In Nigeria and many oil-dependent countries, policymakers are once again eagerly looking for the $50 a barrel mark. Fortunately, they are not sitting at a $30 a barrel position from where they suffered early in 2016. So what happens now? What is the future of oil? Can present-day supply and demand conditions tell us anything? So let us look at the demand side. The current major global conversation is about the future of crude oil and how soon before it becomes a sunset industry. With electric cars that depend on batteries and are easier and cheaper to operate and maintain, and also renewable energy platforms that provide cleaner energy than petroleum, who will be looking in the direction of crude oil? Yes, I know that many petroleum industry protagonists, solicitors, and advocates are staunchly arguing that crude oil demand is without end. This is what also happened when we converted from the energy of camels, horses, buggies, and even slave labor. I agree with them that because crude oil has been so singularly transformational, it can't fade away in its use so easily. But it will. First, it will because people know it is not exactly renewable, and therefore they would rather invest in devices and mechanisms that will use renewable energy. Second, looking at the supply side, a day will suddenly come when it will be all gone. So what happens to nations that just talk about economic diversification without aggressively coming up with policies that ensure that it happens speedily? Well, the things that happen to such nations will happen to them, and it is not usually good. The time has come for our scientists and business people to be more innovative. The time has also come for our policymakers to stand up. I'm Magnus Kpakol, and that's my view.
Magnus.